The rain had been falling for hours, soft and endless, tapping against the chapel windows like a whisper no one wanted to hear. Inside, the air felt heavier than grief itself, cold, still, almost frozen in time. Emily sat in the front row, her black dress damp at the edges, her hands clenched tightly around the small white rose she had brought for him. There were 20 chairs in the room. Only 4 were filled. Not a single face from her family. Not her mother. Not her father. Not even her best friend, the one who had promised, "I'll always be there for you." She kept turning toward the door, hoping anyone would walk in. But the door never opened. Just silence, broken only by the low hum of the organ and the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. People whispered behind her. "Where's her family?" one asked quietly. Maybe she didn't tell them, another said. But she had told them. She had called, begged, cried, and they chose not to come. At that moment, something inside her broke, not with a scream, but with a silence so deep it almost swallowed her whole. The kind of silence that changes who you are. Outside, thunder rolled across the grey sky as the priest began to speak. Emily couldn't hear a single word. All she could think was how love, loyalty, and family, the things she had once built her life around, were gone. She didn't know it yet, but this day wasn't just her husband's funeral. It was the funeral of her old life, the start of something darker, quieter, and far stronger. Because when everyone you love walks away, you either break apart or learn how to stand completely alone. Emily had always been a careful dreamer. She grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house looked identical, every yard manicured, and every family seemed predictable. Her parents were the kind of people who measured love in appearances and obligations. They were proud, proper, and endlessly concerned with what the neighbors thought. From an early age, Emily learned that her feelings had to be secondary. Polite smiles over true confessions. Neat little nods over messy emotions. She loved fiercely, but she learned to hide it behind a practiced calm. Her best friend Sarah was the only person who knew the tempest beneath the surface. It was at a bookstore, of all places, where she met Daniel. He was rearranging a stack of novels with that casual, easy energy that made people feel like everything around them suddenly slowed down. Emily had reached for the same copy of a poetry book, and their hands brushed. She remembered thinking, I could follow him anywhere. From that day forward, their lives intertwined with an intensity that both terrified and exhilarated her. Coffee dates turned into late-night walks, walks turned into weekend trips, trips turned into shared apartments, and finally, shared dreams. Daniel understood her silences. He understood her quiet fury when the world didn't match her expectations. He laughed at her awkward jokes, held her when she cried at sad movies, and even tolerated her obsession with perfect little plants. For a while, it was perfect, but perfection, Emily would later learn, has cracks invisible to the naked eye. Those cracks weren't in Daniel. He was kind, loyal, loving, but in the world around her. Her parents disapproved of her choices from the start, questioning everything about Daniel, his job, his family background, even the way he tied his shoes. They saw a good boy, but not the kind of boy they wanted for their daughter. They complained politely, argued quietly, and occasionally in their way tried to pull Emily back toward the version of life they had planned for her. Emily felt torn. She loved Daniel in a way that was full and consuming, but love alone could not erase the tension at family dinners, the cold judgment in her parents' eyes, the subtle but relentless questions. Are you making the right choices? Is this really what you want? Even Sarah, who had been her confidant since childhood, sometimes hesitated. Are you sure about him? She would ask, and Emily would have to fight the urge to snap, Of course I am. She never admitted that in quieter moments, she sometimes felt like she was living 2 lives, one for Daniel, one for her family. Yet, Daniel never gave up. He met her halfway at every turn, comforting her when her mother criticized her, laughing when her father muttered under his breath, even joining Emily in subtle acts of rebellion, staying out late, picking out furniture her parents would never approve of, moving into a slightly messy apartment because their rules mattered more than anyone else's. For years, that tiny rebellion was enough. The love between Emily and Daniel acted as a shield, a cocoon that insulated them from judgment. But deep down, she knew the cracks would never fully disappear. She didn't notice them at first. The missed calls from her parents, the small coldness in Sarah's voice, the little glances that seemed to measure her loyalty to someone else. Each was a pinprick, barely noticeable at first, but together they began to etch lines into her heart she couldn't ignore. And yet, she pressed on, believing that love, that loyalty, could outweigh family disapproval, that it could protect her from the loneliness that always seemed just around the corner. Little did Emily know that those cracks, so small and ignorable back then, would one day widen into a chasm she could not cross. The chasm that would swallow her completely on the day of Daniel's funeral. And when that day came, she would realize that the people she had trusted most, the ones who promised to stand by her, would all be absent. How had the life she built with Daniel prepared her for a grief so complete, so isolating? The answer would come too late. The years passed, and Emily and Daniel's life together grew in its quiet, unassuming way. They had routines, small victories, and little rituals that made their apartment feel like a sanctuary. Every morning, Daniel would brew coffee just the way Emily liked it. Strong, with the tuts. Cysteine, cinnamon, and she would bring him a slice of toast with jam, watching him drink it with a half smile that always made her heart tighten. Outside their bubble, the world continued its quiet disapproval. Her parents remained polite but distant, sending holiday cards that felt like polite reminders of a world Emily no longer fully belonged to. Invitations to family gatherings came with subtle pressures, veiled criticisms, and questions that always circled back to Daniel. "Are you sure he's serious about work?" her father would ask. "Does he understand our way of life?" her mother would whisper over the phone. Emily would answer, each time a little more quietly than the last, "Yes, he's perfect for me." She didn't realize how quietly the world was chipping away at her, until one evening when Daniel came home from work with a small envelope in his hand. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "It's from your mother," Daniel replied softly. He handed it to her, and Emily unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning lines that were meant to sound caring but hit like ice. Her mother wrote about how she hoped Emily was making the right decisions, that some sacrifices had to be made for a proper life, and that she hoped Emily would consider her family's perspective more seriously. Emily folded the letter back into the envelope and let out a quiet sigh. Daniel watched her, concern in his eyes. "You're not mad at me, right?" he asked. "I'm not sure how to feel," Emily admitted. She sank onto the couch, holding the letter like it was a fragile object that might break. Daniel sat beside her and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together," he said. And they were. But those small cracks continued to widen, not because of what Daniel did, but because of the distance between Emily and her family. The unspoken judgments, the absent support, the quiet erosion of trust. Then came the illness. At first, it was subtle. Daniel would tire easily, complain of headaches, or brush off minor pains with a casual joke. Emily, wrapped up in her own careful world, noticed, but she didn't panic. She trusted him, as she always had. But when the doctor delivered the news, it was like a punch that knocked the air out of her lungs. A serious, aggressive illness, something that could change everything, something she couldn't protect him from, no matter how much she loved him. The hospital room smelled sterile, bitter, and cold. Emily held Daniel's hand as tears ran down her cheeks, feeling a helplessness that was foreign to her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to call someone, anyone, for help. And instinctively, she reached for her family first. She called her mother. No answer. Her father. Voicemail. Sarah. Busy. Sorry, can't talk right now. The realization hit her like lightning. The people she had trusted most, the ones who had promised unwavering support, were either too busy, too distant, or simply unwilling to be there when it truly mattered. Daniel looked at her, eyes calm despite his own fear. "We'll get through this," he whispered. "Together." And she believed him. But deep inside, Emily knew something had changed. The invisible cracks of her life, family, friends, the expectations she had clung to were now glaring gaps that she couldn't ignore. For weeks, Emily juggled hospital visits, medications, and endless paperwork. Every time she looked at the door, a tiny hope sparked that someone would appear. A familiar face, a voice of comfort. But every time, she was disappointed. Every time, she realized that when life demanded support, the world she had trusted might not answer. The nights were the worst. Emily would sit by Daniel's side, holding his hand as he slept, whispering reassurances she barely felt herself. In the quiet, she could hear her mother's voice from years ago, asking why she had chosen Daniel, why she couldn't just follow the right path. The echoes made her chest tighten, but they also fueled a quiet resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Emily began to understand something vital. The world wouldn't pause for her grief. People might not come, might not care, and might not show up. And yet, she had to be present, fully present, for the man she loved more than anything. She didn't know it yet, but these weeks, these endless hours in sterile hospital rooms and quiet corridors, were preparing her for a moment that would change everything. A moment where the absence of those who claimed to love her would be felt more sharply than anything else in her life. And when that day finally arrived, the day that would test every ounce of her strength, Emily would discover the bitter truth. The people she expected to stand beside her in her darkest hour wouldn't. Not a single one. And that absence would leave a wound deeper than she could imagine. The final days of Daniel's life were a blur of beeping machines, whispered conversations with doctors, and the constant hum of sterile hospital corridors. Emily never left his side, her hand always resting on his, as if her touch alone could hold him in this world. Each night, she would whisper stories of their early days, the bookstore encounter, their first shared apartment, the coffee rituals, trying to remind him and herself that love had been real, enduring, unshakable. Her phone rarely rang with comforting voices. Calls from her parents went unanswered. Sarah's messages came in late, brief and apologetic. Each unanswered call, each delayed message, felt like another quiet betrayal, another confirmation that the world she had built her heart around was slowly crumbling. Daniel, despite his weakening condition, would always squeeze her hand and offer a faint smile. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured one evening, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. "You'll be okay, after." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed him. She was terrified. Not just for him, but for the reality she feared awaited her. Facing the loss, the grief, and the haunting absence of the people she had trusted most. The day he passed, the sky outside mirrored her emotions. Grey, heavy, and relentless. Emily held his hand until the very last breath, feeling a piece of herself dissolve with him. She whispered a final goodbye that no one else would hear, tears sliding down her cheeks, unchecked, raw, and unguarded. The hospital staff murmured condolences, gentle but professional, and then, after the final arrangements, Emily was left alone to navigate what came next. She called her family first, almost instinctively, almost hoping for a miracle. Her mother's voicemail picked up. Her father didn't answer. And Sarah, a text. "I'm so sorry. I can't make it." The emptiness settled around her like a cold cloak. She couldn't remember ever feeling so utterly isolated. It wasn't just grief. It was the stark realization that the people she had trusted most, the people who should have been there, were choosing their own priorities over her pain. The days leading up to the funeral were a haze of logistics, phone calls to funeral homes, organizing flowers, and sending notifications. Each phone call, each planning decision reminded her that she was facing this alone. Friends offered help where they could, but Emily's mind kept circling back to one painful truth. The chairs that should have been filled with family, the hugs that should have been there for comfort, would remain empty. And yet, she moved forward, step by step. She dressed in black, selected the simple rose she knew Daniel loved, and rehearsed the speech she wasn't even sure she could deliver. She tried to summon the strength she had drawn from the early days of their love, the quiet rebellion against her parents' judgment, and the unwavering support Daniel had always given her. But nothing could prepare her for the moment she entered the funeral chapel. The doors opened slowly, and Emily stepped inside, scanning the rows of chairs. Only a handful of people she knew were there. Friends, neighbours, a few distant colleagues of Daniel. But the faces she had hoped to see, the ones that mattered most, were nowhere to be found. Her parents were absent. Her best friend Sarah was absent. No familiar warmth, no gentle hand to hold, no comforting voice to whisper that she wasn't alone. It was worse than she had imagined. The emptiness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A sharp reminder that loyalty, love, and family weren't always constants. Her heart ached in ways she hadn't anticipated, a deep, relentless pain that seemed to echo through the entire chapel. And yet, amid the grief, a spark of clarity emerged. Emily realized she could not change the choices others had made. She could not force them to care, to show up, or to share in her pain. She could only honor Daniel in the way he deserved, with love, with courage, and with presence. As the priest began to speak, Emily's eyes fell on the empty chairs, and she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a funeral for Daniel. It was a turning point for her, the beginning of a journey she hadn't anticipated, a journey that would test her resilience, her heart, and the very core of who she was. And when the ceremony was over, when the last flower had been laid and the chapel emptied of whispers, Emily would step into a world that had been waiting for her to realize one brutal truth. The people she loved most might abandon her, but she would have to find the strength to stand alone, stronger than ever, or risk being consumed by the loneliness that now defined her reality. The chapel had emptied, leaving only the faint scent of lilies and candle wax lingering in the air. Emily lingered for a moment, her hands still clutching the small white rose she had brought for Daniel. Each breath she drew felt heavy, as though the air itself carried the weight of her grief. She walked slowly toward the exit, her eyes scanning the empty pews once more. The emptiness wasn't just in the room, it was everywhere, gnawing at her from the inside. Outside, the world continued without pause. Cars hummed past, strangers moved in indifferent rhythm, and even the rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and grey. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her, but the chill she felt wasn't from the weather. It was the realization that the people she expected to be her refuge, her parents, her best friend, the ones who had promised unwavering loyalty, had abandoned her at the moment she needed them most. She walked to her car, each step a mix of numbness and anger. Questions circled endlessly in her mind. Why hadn't they come? What could she have done differently? The more she replayed every conversation, every subtle warning, every moment she had hoped for their support, the more the ache in her chest turned into a dull, persistent fire. At home, Emily sank into the couch, rose still in hand, staring blankly at the wall. Daniel's absence was a physical void she could feel in her bones, but the absence of her family and closest friends made it deeper, sharper, almost unbearable. She thought of the calls she had made, the voicemails, the unanswered messages, the promises that now rang hollow. It wasn't just grief she was facing, it was betrayal. And yet, as raw and consuming as it was, there was something else beginning to stir within her. Clarity. The truth was brutal, but it was undeniable. She could not rely on anyone else for the strength she needed. She could not force love or loyalty where it did not exist. She could only rely on herself. That evening, Emily sat at the small kitchen table, hands trembling as she poured herself a cup of tea. The house felt emptier than ever, echoes of Daniel's laughter lingering in the corners, and the shadows of absence stretching across the walls. She thought about confronting her parents, about demanding answers, about expressing the anger that had been coiled inside her for months, maybe years. She picked up her phone and stared at their numbers. Her thumb hovered over the call button, unsure if she could summon the courage. Instead, she found herself typing a message she would never send. How could you not come? He deserved you. I deserved you. And yet, you chose not to be here. Her thoughts then turned to Sarah. She had been the one person Emily had believed would always be by her side. And yet, even Sarah had failed. Even the closest friend could not bridge the gap between love and presence. Emily realized that life didn't care about promises. It cared about action. The days following the funeral blurred into a series of small, silent rituals. Emily would sit by the window, staring at the rain-soaked streets, reflecting on memories with Daniel. She sorted through his belongings, each item a shard of the life they had shared, each object a painful reminder of what was gone. And through it all, she began to sense something unexpected, a strength she hadn't fully recognized before. It was not the kind of strength that came from others. It was not the support of family or friends. It was raw, internal, forged from the fire of loss and the necessity of survival. She realized that moving forward, she would have to rely on this inner reservoir, no matter how deep the loneliness ran or how heavy the grief became. And as Emily began to make tentative plans for the days ahead, notifying distant relatives, closing accounts, and organizing memorials, she could feel the shadow of her family's absence pressing down on her. It was a constant, unyielding weight, reminding her that the people who should have been anchors in her life had chosen not to be there. Yet, amid the despair, a quiet determination began to emerge. She would honor Daniel not with anger, not with resentment, but with life. Her life, lived fully, even in the absence of those who had abandoned her. The journey ahead would be difficult, and she would face it largely alone. But for the first time, she felt the stirrings of something profound: self-reliance, courage, and an unshakable sense of purpose born from loss. But Emily's journey was far from over. The silence left by her family's absence would not stay quiet for long. Unanswered questions, unresolved anger, and the ghosts of promises broken were waiting for her. And soon, she would have to confront them all. How would she face the people who abandoned her? And more importantly, could she forgive them? Or would the weight of their absence define the rest of her life? The morning after the funeral, Emily found herself staring at her phone once again. Messages, missed calls, and unanswered texts formed a chaotic grid of reminders that her family had chosen their absence over presence. Her thumb hovered over her mother's name, trembling slightly. She wanted answers, closure, something, anything that would explain the void. Finally, with a deep breath, she dialed. "Hello?" her mother answered, voice casual, almost indifferent. "Why didn't you come?" Emily's voice was barely controlled, a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. There was a pause on the other end. "Emily, it was difficult. You know how things are." Emily's heart sank further. Difficult. Difficult didn't begin to cover the raw absence she had felt. "Difficult?" she repeated. "My husband died, Mum. He was the man I loved. And no one, not you, not Dad, not Sarah, showed up. Difficult?" Her mother's sigh was heavy, weary, almost rehearsed. We thought it would be best. You know, we had other commitments." Emily couldn't bear to listen. She hung up, her hands shaking, tears streaming freely now. She walked to the living room window and stared at the street below, watching the world move on as if nothing had happened. The realization hit her harder than any grief she had felt that day. The people she had counted on, the ones who promised loyalty and support, had abandoned her at the moment she needed them most. Later that evening, Sarah arrived, hesitantly, awkwardly, almost afraid of Emily's anger. She sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with her hands. I'm so sorry," she said softly. I couldn't. I had to work and I... Emily closed her eyes, fighting the urge to shout. Instead, she let out a long, shuddering breath. Sarah. It's not just about you missing the funeral. It's about everything. The calls, the check-ins, the promises. They didn't matter when it counted. Sarah's head dropped. I know, I didn't know how to help. Emily stared at her, her mind spinning. She wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something. But instead, she felt something different stirring. Clarity. Anger, yes. Raw and unfiltered. But also a seed of understanding. She had been searching for support externally, for validation, for someone else to help her carry a burden that only she could bear. That night, she wandered through her apartment, touching the small mementos of her life with Daniel. Photographs, keepsakes, little notes tucked away in drawers. Each item reminded her of love that had been steadfast, unwavering, and real. The realization was painful, yet empowering. While her family and closest friends had failed her, Daniel had not. Their life together, the bond they shared, was proof that love could exist independently of anyone else's presence or approval. Over the next few days, Emily began to reclaim small pieces of herself. She cooked meals she and Daniel used to love, wrote letters to no one in particular, and spent long hours walking through the park where they had shared countless memories. Each step, each gesture, was a quiet declaration. She would survive this. She would honor Daniel, and she would not allow absence to define her. But the wounds of betrayal were not easily forgotten. She replayed conversations, remembered arguments long past, and questioned herself constantly. Could she forgive them? Could she let go of the resentment, or would it fester, shaping her life as painfully as their absence had shaped that funeral day? Emily's nights were restless. Shadows of the past crept in. Memories of family dinners where judgment outweighed love. Moments where she had sought connection but found distance. Each flashback was a reminder of what she had lost. Not just Daniel, but the people she had expected to lean on when her world collapsed. Yet, amid the grief and anger, she began to sense the faint outline of something else. Independence, resilience, and the realization that she could, for the first time, rely fully on herself. The very absence that had felt like betrayal was slowly becoming the crucible in which her strength was forged. But Emily's journey was far from over. The silence left by her family's absence would not remain passive. Old wounds would resurface, uncomfortable truths would demand confrontation, and the path toward healing would be challenged by memories, choices, and revelations she had yet to face. Could she embrace her newfound strength without succumbing to anger? The answers lay ahead, waiting to be uncovered. The weeks after the funeral settled into a rhythm of quiet reflection and painful clarity. Emily found herself awake long before sunrise, wandering through the apartment that now felt both empty and sacred. Each room held memories of Daniel, the morning sunlight on his favorite chair, the lingering scent of his cologne in the closet, the way his shoes always ended up slightly askew near the door. These traces of him were painful, yes, but they were also reminders that love had existed in its purest form. Emily began to write. At first, it was clumsy half-formed sentences, broken thoughts, letters she would never send. But writing became a lifeline, a way to process her grief without relying on anyone else. On the pages, she confronted the absence of her family and closest friends. She catalogued every missed call, every empty chair, every whispered excuse that had denied her the comfort she needed. "I don't need you to explain," she wrote one evening. "I just need to feel the truth of my own strength." She started taking long walks in the neighborhood park, the place where she and Daniel had spent countless afternoons. The rhythm of her steps, the chill in the morning air, the distant laughter of children, it all grounded her. With each step, she let go of the illusions she had held for years. The idea that family loyalty was guaranteed, that friendship was unconditional, that love from others was a shield against life's cruelties. Emily discovered that survival was not just about endurance. It was about reclaiming control over her own life. She began to cook the meals she and Daniel loved, listening to his favorite songs as she moved through the kitchen. She organized photographs and keepsakes, placing them in a corner of the living room that she called their memory nook. Each gesture, no matter how small, was a step toward reclaiming herself. Her nights, though, remained the hardest. Shadows of loneliness crept in, whispering doubts and fears. The absence of her parents and best friend weighed on her like a physical burden. She often found herself questioning her own worth, wondering why those she loved most could walk away at the moment she needed them most. But Emily's grief was no longer purely destructive. It became fuel, a source of clarity and determination. She realized that the people who had abandoned her had done so not because of her failures, but because of their own limitations. Their absence was a truth she could not change, but her response to it was entirely hers. In the quiet hours, Emily began to plan. She thought about the things she wanted to achieve, the life she wanted to create in honor of Daniel. She dreamed of a home filled with love, laughter, and meaning, a life shaped by intention rather than expectation. She knew it would be difficult. She knew there would be days when the pain would feel unbearable. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that her life could be hers entirely. Emily also started setting boundaries. She would reach out to her family, not to demand apologies or explanations, but to assert her own needs and protect herself from further harm. She understood that reconciliation might not happen on her timeline, or at all, and she was learning to accept that reality. The power, she realized, lay not in their presence, but in her choice to move forward regardless of it. Each small victory, a day without tears, a night of uninterrupted sleep, a smile at a memory of Daniel, strengthened her. Emily began to understand that grief and resilience were not mutually exclusive. She could mourn deeply and still find the courage to continue. She could honor Daniel's memory and still carve out a life for herself. And through it all, a quiet, unshakable truth emerged. She was not defined by the people who abandoned her. She was defined by her love, her courage, and the unwavering commitment to live, even in the shadow of unimaginable loss. But as Emily began to embrace her independence, she would face new challenges. Unexpected reminders of betrayal, difficult confrontations, and moments where her strength would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Could she maintain the resilience she had forged? Or would the weight of absence threaten to break her once more? The answers awaited in the days to come. A week had passed since the funeral, yet the absence of her family still clung to Emily like a shadow she couldn't shake. The phone rang occasionally, but it was mostly distant voices, formal and hesitant, offering condolences that felt empty. She knew that if she wanted resolution, she would have to create it herself. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "We thought it would be best." The words had haunted her since that cold day in the chapel, and now she could no longer ignore them. Emily picked up the phone and dialed, her hands steady despite the storm of emotion inside her. "Mum, I need to understand something," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "Why didn't you come to Daniel's funeral?" There was a pause. A sigh. "Emily, it was complicated. You know how your father and I feel about certain things." "Complicated," Emily repeated. "My husband is gone, Mum, and your complicated choice left me alone in the most important moment of my life. I need you to be honest with me." Her mother hesitated. We didn't want to see you in pain. We thought perhaps you would cope better without us there." Emily's hands shook slightly, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. "Cope better. Mum, that's not how it works. You weren't protecting me. You abandoned me. And the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever forgive that. But I needed to hear your honesty, not excuses." The line went silent. Emily hung up, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. She hadn't received the apology or understanding she wanted, but she had asserted her voice. That small act of confrontation, of standing up to the people who had hurt her, felt like the first real step toward reclaiming herself. Later that day, Sarah visited, a little more cautiously than before. Emily shared the truth of her feelings, the anger, the pain, the profound sense of betrayal. She told Sarah she understood that life sometimes pulled people away, but she could no longer excuse the absence when it mattered most. Sarah listened, her eyes filling with tears, and for the first time, Emily felt a genuine exchange of understanding. Emily realized that empowerment was not about revenge or confrontation alone. It was about acknowledging the pain, facing it head-on, and taking deliberate action to reclaim one's life. She spent the next few days setting boundaries, making decisions that prioritized her needs, and slowly constructing a daily routine that nourished her mind and heart. She began volunteering at a local community center, offering her time to those who were lonely or grieving. Every interaction reminded her that connection could exist beyond family, that meaningful relationships were formed through empathy, effort, and mutual support. One evening, Emily sat by the window, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. She thought about Daniel, about the love they shared, and about the absence of those she once depended on. The pain was still there, but it had softened into something she could carry without being crushed by it. She had begun to transform her grief into purpose, her sorrow into a guide for living more fully. But life has a way of testing even the strongest resolve. A letter arrived one morning, addressed in her mother's familiar handwriting. Emily hesitated, unsure if she was ready to read it. Her thumb lingered over the envelope. When she finally opened it, the words inside were measured, polite, tinged with regret, but still lacking the depth of understanding she had longed for. Emily read the letter twice, then set it down. She felt a moment of sadness, followed by a spark of clarity. She could not control her family's actions or force them to be present. She could only control how she responded, how she rebuilt her life, and how she honored Daniel's memory through her strength and choices. For the first time, she felt the faintest glimmer of empowerment, the realization that her life was hers to shape, regardless of those who had abandoned her. Every tear, every sleepless night, every pang of betrayal had forged a resilience that could no longer be denied. But Emily's journey was far from complete. The emotional scars of absence and betrayal would resurface in unexpected ways, testing the strength she had fought so hard to claim. Would she be able to face the final truths of her past, embrace her independence fully, and find lasting peace? The next chapter of her story held the answers, and the challenges she had yet to confront. Days turned into weeks, and Emily began to feel a quiet rhythm returning to her life. The apartment, once a hollow reminder of absence, had started to feel like a sanctuary of her own making. She organized Daniel's belongings with care, displayed their shared memories with reverence, and even started small rituals that honored him daily. Lighting a candle in the evening, leaving fresh flowers in the corner of the living room, and playing the music they both loved. She had begun venturing beyond the confines of her grief, exploring new routines, reconnecting with herself, and slowly embracing the independence that had once seemed impossible. Each step was deliberate, each choice a declaration. She would no longer be defined by the absence of others. Emily started taking long walks in the neighborhood, observing the world without the lens of expectation. She noticed the laughter of children playing in the park, the elderly couples sharing quiet moments on benches, the baristas who greeted her by name at the local coffee shop. Life had not stopped for her loss, and slowly she began to remember that it didn't have to stop her either. Her volunteer work at the community center became a lifeline. She met others navigating grief, loneliness, and absence, and through their stories she saw reflections of her own pain. It was in helping them, listening, comforting, sharing, that Emily discovered a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that love, connection, and fulfillment could exist outside the structures that had once failed her. Yet, the memories of Daniel's funeral, the empty chairs, and the voices that never came still haunted her. Some nights she would sit alone, staring at the ceiling, and feel the sharp pang of abandonment. But now, she met that pain with resilience rather than despair. She allowed herself to feel it fully, to honor it, and then gently let it go, refusing to let it dictate her future. One afternoon, a call came from her mother. Hesitant, cautious, almost afraid. Emily listened as her mother spoke of regret, apologies, and missed opportunities. For the first time, Emily didn't respond with anger. Instead, she simply listened, her heart steady. She realized that closure wasn't about forcing understanding or seeking validation. It was about accepting the truth of what had happened and choosing her own path forward. Emily also began reconnecting with Sarah on her own terms. They spent long evenings talking, sharing memories of Daniel and reflecting on the ways life had changed them. Emily forgave where she could, not to excuse past actions, but to free herself from the chains of resentment. In doing so, she discovered that empowerment came not from the absence of pain, but from the courage to move through it with grace and strength. Her independence grew in tangible ways too. She made decisions about her home, finances, and career that reflected her desires rather than anyone else's expectations. She traveled, took courses she had long postponed, and even started to dream of new relationships, not to replace Daniel, but to honor the love she still carried within her. And yet, Emily knew that true resolution was not a single event, but a continuous process. Life would test her, challenge her, and confront her with reminders of absence, loss, and betrayal. But she had learned a critical truth. While others' choices could hurt her, they could never define her. Her strength, her courage, and her capacity to love were hers alone. But the journey toward complete emotional freedom was not yet finished. Unexpected challenges, remnants of old wounds, and the weight of unresolved family tensions still lingered on the horizon. Could Emily maintain her newfound independence while facing these final tests? Or would the echoes of the past threaten to unravel her hard-won strength? The answers would soon be revealed. Life had begun to settle into a new rhythm for Emily, but the echoes of absence and unresolved conflict continued to ripple through her days. Letters from her parents, messages from acquaintances, and occasional awkward encounters reminded her that the past was never fully gone. She had learned to navigate it, to let much of it roll off her shoulders, but certain moments still provoked an unexpected sting. One afternoon, a distant cousin called. "I heard about Daniel," they said hesitantly. "I'm so sorry. Maybe your parents should have told you sooner." Emily listened, nodding even though no one could see her. The cousin's words only emphasized what she already knew. Her family had abandoned her at a critical time. And while she had begun to accept it, the anger still lingered, simmering quietly beneath her calm exterior. She reflected on the moments she had spent arguing with her mother, pleading for explanations, trying to make sense of absences that had left her hollow. Each confrontation had ended with more questions than answers, yet Emily now saw a pattern. She could demand accountability, but she could not force empathy or presence from those unwilling to give it. The realization was bitter, but liberating. Emily decided to take action, not to seek revenge or punish anyone, but to reclaim her life fully. She organized a small memorial at the park where she and Daniel had spent countless afternoons, inviting friends who had genuinely supported her during the difficult days. There were no empty promises, no reluctant attendees, only genuine connections, laughter, and tears shared with people who mattered. Standing there, holding Daniel's favorite rose, Emily felt a surge of empowerment. She realized that family was not defined by blood alone, and love could be nurtured through choice and action rather than obligation. This understanding didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it into strength. Still, challenges came in subtle ways. Her mother sent another letter, carefully worded, full of polite remorse but lacking real acknowledgement. Emily read it twice, felt the familiar ache, and then deliberately set it aside. She had learned to engage on her own terms, choosing battles worth fighting and letting go of those that served only to drain her energy. Emily also began to explore parts of herself she had neglected for years. She returned to hobbies she had abandoned, signed up for classes she had always dreamed of taking, and allowed herself moments of joy that had previously felt forbidden in grief. Each decision was a quiet rebellion, a declaration of independence, and a testament to the resilience she had built through her trials. At night, she would often sit by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, reflecting on how far she had come. She thought about Daniel, the life they shared, and the love that had sustained her even in the face of profound absence. She understood now that grief was not a weakness. It was a conduit to courage, clarity, and self-reliance. Emily's journey had not been easy. She had been forced to confront betrayal, disappointment, and loneliness, and the road had been littered with heartbreak. Yet each step she had taken had shaped her into someone stronger, someone capable of facing the world on her own terms. She had learned that independence was not merely surviving alone. It was thriving, even when the past threatened to pull her back into shadows. And now, standing on the brink of her next chapter, Emily would face the ultimate test, fully embracing a life shaped by her own choices, letting go of lingering resentment, and discovering whether true peace and fulfillment could finally take root. The final step of her journey awaited, and with it, the chance for complete emotional closure. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and warm, a quiet contrast to the storm that had defined Emily's life for months. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands, and for the first time in a long while, felt a sense of calm. The grief was still there, a gentle ache that lingered like a shadow, but it no longer controlled her. Emily reflected on the journey she had travelled. She had faced unimaginable loss, the absence of those she thought would always be there, and the stark reality of betrayal. She had confronted her family, spoken her truth, and learned that closure could not be demanded. It had to be claimed within herself. She remembered the empty chapel, the hollow chairs, and the weight of silence that had once threatened to consume her. But now, those memories were no longer prisons. They had become reminders of her resilience, the crucible in which her strength had been forged. Today, Emily made a decision, a conscious, deliberate choice to embrace her life fully. She would honor Daniel not through mourning alone, but through living with intention, joy, and courage. She would nurture relationships that were reciprocal, invest in endeavors that inspired her, and continue the small rituals that kept his memory alive in her heart. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from distant family, others from friends she had trusted. Emily responded with honesty and boundaries, allowing connection where it was genuine, but no longer permitting the weight of empty apologies or absent support to dictate her emotions. She had learned the hard truth. Love and loyalty could not be demanded from others, but strength, compassion, and forgiveness could be cultivated within herself. In the afternoon, Emily went to the park where she and Daniel had once spent lazy summer afternoons. She walked slowly along the winding paths, the breeze carrying the faint scent of flowers and fresh grass. Pausing by a familiar bench, she placed a single white rose, a quiet tribute to the man who had been her anchor in the storm. As she sat there, memories of laughter, small arguments, late-night talks, and tender gestures filled her mind. She allowed herself to feel the full spectrum of emotions, sorrow, love, longing, and gratitude, without fear. For the first time, grief and joy could coexist, and she felt whole rather than fractured. Emily realized that forgiveness was not about condoning the absence or betrayal of others. It was about freeing herself from the weight of resentment. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet acknowledgement of her parents, Sarah, and everyone who had failed to stand by her, not in anger, but in acceptance. They were imperfect, just as she had once been, and she was no longer willing to let their choices define her life. Returning home, Emily felt a sense of purpose she had not known before. She organized her plans for the coming months, set goals she had long postponed, and allowed herself moments of joy without guilt. She laughed softly at memories, cried when necessary, and let each emotion flow without judgment. That evening, as the city lights flickered outside her window, Emily felt a profound shift within her. She was no longer defined by loss, absence, or betrayal. She was defined by resilience, love, and the courage to embrace life fully. The woman who had walked into the chapel alone, burdened by grief and abandoned by those she trusted most, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. Emily understood now that life would continue to bring challenges, unexpected trials, and moments of pain. But she also knew she had the strength to face them, alone if necessary, with grace and integrity. She had discovered the ultimate truth. Peace and fulfillment were not dependent on others. They were nurtured within, grown from resilience, and watered with love, memory, and courage. As she placed Daniel's favorite book on the shelf, Emily smiled softly. The journey had been long, painful, and transformative. She had mourned, confronted betrayal, rebuilt herself, and emerged stronger. And in that moment, she felt an unshakable calm, a sense of completion, and the quiet joy of knowing that life, with all its imperfections, could still be beautiful. The storm had passed. Emily had endured, and she was finally free. As Emily's story comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. Life doesn't always go the way we expect. The people we count on the most can sometimes let us down, but true strength comes from within. Emily endured loss, betrayal, and abandonment, and yet she emerged stronger, wiser, and fully in control of her own life. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Revenge Proofs for more powerful stories of resilience, courage, and unexpected twists. We want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us. Have you ever faced a moment where the people you trusted the most let you down? How did you find the strength to move forward? Your story might inspire someone else to overcome their struggles. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an emotional, thought-provoking story like Emily's. Remember, life may challenge you, but your strength and courage can prove just how unstoppable you really are. Thank you for watching Revenge Proofs, where stories of heartbreak, resilience, and justice come alive. We'll see you in the next story.